Welcome to the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and the University of Toronto. On behalf of the Faculty of Arts and Science and Munk School Director Peter Lowen, I am delighted that you can all join us for today's event with the Honourable Mélanie Joly, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Professor Janice Stein. Minister Joly and Professor Stein take the stage. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce the Honourable Mélanie Joly, Minister of Foreign Affairs. Minister Mélanie Joly was first elected to represent Cartierville in the House of Commons in 2015. She has previously served as Minister of Economic Development, Minister of Tourism, Official Languages and La Francophonie, and Minister of Canadian Heritage. In her ministerial roles, Minister Joly has worked to promote Canadian culture and to grow and increase the visibility of Canada's tourism sector. She has also worked to safeguard Canada's 2 official languages while promoting the use of French in Canada and around the world, including in the digital sphere. Prior to entering federal politics, Minister Joly founded the Vrai Changement pour Montréal party and ran for mayor of Montreal in 2013 under its banner. Minister Joly holds an Honours Bachelor of Law from the Université de Montréal and a Magister Juris in European and Comparative Law from the University of Oxford. She is the author of Changing the Rules of the Game, in which she shares her vision for public policy and civic engagement. She was named a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum. Minister Joly, welcome to the University of Toronto.
Well, thank you, Melanie. Great first name, by the way. And thank you for having me today. It's great to see so many familiar faces and, well, to see people in general. And I'm glad that a fantastic colleague of mine who works with me and has been an extremely hardworking parliamentary secretary, Rob Oliphant, is with me. I think it's worth it that we give him a round of applause. Thank you, Rob, for being here. Other MPs are here as well. Yara, Han is here. Boris, who used to be part of our caucus. Very proud Ukraine friend. Thank you for all your work also in these very difficult times. And I know that the president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, the UCC, Alexandra is with us, so thank you for taking the time as well. Donc, ça me fait grand plaisir d'avoir l'occasion de vous parler aujourd'hui et de pouvoir échanger avec vous. Je sais qu'il y a quelques personnes qui proviennent du ministère également. Et si vous avez des questions en français, ça me fait plaisir aussi d'y répondre. And thank you, of course, merci, Janice. Thank you, Janice, for organizing this along with the Munk School and for all the conversations we've had together. It's really helpful. So, folks, I wish I was here in a different context. When I visited Kyiv in January, Ukrainians welcomed me with open arms, shared their love for their country, and as well as their anxiety about what was to come. That seems just like yesterday, and yet so much has changed. The sad reality is that I bring with me today thoughts of Ukrainian mothers, grandmothers, children fleeing their home that I met in Rzeszów, south of Poland, just last week, near the Ukraine border. My Ukrainian counterpart, Dmitry Kuleba, who remains strong in an extremely difficult situation. President Zelensky, who moved Canada and all the MPs here with his address to Parliament earlier this week. The images of human suffering and loss across across the collective screens are heartbreaking. And I know they have had a profound impact on all of us. In honor of those lost and inspired by the courage of Ukrainians, Canada is doing everything we can to advance diplomatic solutions and provide critical support to Ukraine. Canada has sanctioned over 1,000 Russian and Belarusian individuals and entities. We cut Russian banks off from the international SWIFT banking system. We ban crude oil imports. We ban Russian and Belarusian planes from our skies, Russian boats from our ports. We have delivered lethal and non-lethal aid. We have donated nearly $200 million to humanitarian efforts, and we are ready to welcome an unlimited number of Ukrainians fleeing the war to Canada. We have urged Russia to change course, using every tool in our diplomatic toolbox to make that happen. We have taken a leadership role in pushing across multilateral forums, including the United Nations, the G7, NATO, the Arctic Council, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the Commonwealth, and l'Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie. Why? Because unprecedented times command unprecedented actions. Because we know Canadians care deeply and are here to help too. These past weeks are a stark reminder that democracy is not guaranteed and it cannot be taken for granted. Democracy is a choice, often a fight, and it takes work every day to preserve and protect it. Today, the fight for democracy is in Ukraine, but the threat extends around the world. The people of Ukraine, a sovereign country, are fighting for their lives, defending their freedom, their right to choose a better future for their children. We see their strength and courage in face of tyranny. I witnessed their resolve in Poland and Romania, on flights across Europe, in train stations, and even in Red Cross facilities. This war is the choice of one country, the Russian Federation, its government and leadership, and in particular, the decision of President Vladimir Putin. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the greatest threat to world peace since World War II, is part of a coldly calculated and carefully planned sequence of events by the Kremlin. For several months, we have been saying that Russia was positioning troops and equipment to invade Ukraine. Russia claimed that it was not the case and that there was nothing to worry about. Russia lied. President Putin moved those troops over the border and invaded his sovereign neighbor with reckless abandon for human life. He thought he had the military might to take Ukraine within days. It's now been 23 days, and this invasion will fail. President Putin sought to divide the West and exploit our differences, but we are more united than ever. Putin looked to expand his country's influence, but he has plunged it further into isolation and crippled his economy. Beyond the front line, this war is also a war on information as well. President Putin fabricated this crisis through a web of lies and manipulation. He attempted to justify his crimes through claims of genocide, or again, denazification. President Zelensky himself is Jewish, and Putin's pretext couldn't be further from the truth. Bref, en français, je dirais que c'est un tissu de mensonges. Putin is trying to leverage his propaganda machine to rationalize the use of violence. But we see through his lies. We know that this is about his ambition, his flawed ideology. For him, there was never to be a rational conversation about security in Europe. Let me be clear, human rights are universal and can't be manipulated to justify wars and crimes. This is what Canada stands for. This is what I said at the United Nations in Geneva. This is why we led the charge at the International Criminal Court. This is why we're also supporting Ukraine at the International Court of Justice. We will seek accountability. This war is a tragedy. It's an atrocity. But one thing that gives me hope is the collective will of the global community to hold those responsible to account for their actions. This is why we continue to work around the clock and in lockstep with our allies, especially the G7, whom I met just yesterday. We usually gather twice a year, but at this point, it's pretty much every week. Together with our EU and NATO partners, we're having an impact. This is why I traveled to Geneva, Warsaw, Brussels, Bucharest, and Berlin over the past few weeks. I have seen firsthand the creativity and determination of Canada's diplomats. They have been awe-inspiring, and I know we're among many future diplomats here today. I want you to know and be proud of the leadership Canada can have and has had on the world stage. Ukrainians ask for help, and we're up to the task. We have seen truly unprecedented mobilization of the world's economy to impose severe costs on the Russian regime. Just as Russia prepared for this, so did we. Together, we will suffocate the Russian regime, those who have funded and enabled this crisis, and those who fueled the disinformation war that seeks to justify it. We continue to do everything we can to inflict pain on the regime and ensure that there's nowhere left to hide. Through Canadian spirit, the public and private sectors and Canadians from coast to coast to coast have stepped up to meet the moment. I thank each and every one of you who have contributed to the effort in your own way. But the work is not done. We'll need to continue forward, adapting as we go in support of Ukrainians and their fight for freedom. Russia must cease its attack immediately, and no more lives must be lost. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Joly, for those very thoughtful comments. We look forward to the discussion in just a minute. And now we're going to be joined by Janice Stein, the Belzberg Professor of Conflict Management, Department of Political Science in the Munk School. Professor Stein holds the title of University Professor, the university's highest honor, and was the inaugural director of the Munk School. And I'd like to take this moment to acknowledge Melanie and Peter Munk's incredible contribution to the school. Their founding gift has made events like this one possible, where Canadians have the opportunity to engage on these critical issues. So I invite Minister Joly and Professor Stein to take their seats on the stage for the conversation.
Thank you very, very much, Dean Woodin. And let me just say what a great pleasure it is to have the Foreign Minister with us. I don't think there is anyone in this room or anybody online who is not concerned, worried. And you as Foreign Minister, I have to say, you have become Foreign Minister literally at the onset, as you said, the gravest crisis that we have had since World War II. That is an introduction literally by fire that you have had to this portfolio. So let me begin by asking you a difficult question. You are our Minister of Foreign Affairs, you are our diplomat in chief. And I know you're asked this question again and again. There are negotiations that are going on between the Russians and the Ukrainians. There are some informal mediation. You have traveled extensively, as you just said, Minister. Do you see even the tiniest opening for any kind of diplomatic solution in these next few weeks ahead?
Mhm. Well, thank you, Janice, and it's great, and it's an honor to be here, sitting and having this conversation with you. Well, I believe in diplomacy, and I think that while the war is continuing, yes, diplomatic talks will continue. That being said, right now, I'm extremely concerned with how Russia has been acting at the negotiation table. Actually, I don't trust at all what Russia is doing at the negotiation table. And I do so based on a series of facts. First and foremost, Ukrainians have been trying to negotiate humanitarian corridors since the beginning of the war to make sure that civilians would not be targeted, which we know could become a war crime. But while there are negotiations happening on the humanitarian corridor, Russia has been bombarding civilians. The second thing is the Red Cross is fundamental in this reality. It is there to help civilians, to protect them, to give them the first aid they need, to provide humanitarian support in general. And Russia has repeatedly said that they don't want the Red Cross in Ukraine. Imagine that. The Red Cross, which is a neutral organization. And they don't want that because clearly what is happening is war crimes and crimes against humanity are happening as we speak in Ukraine. And so that is why what my colleague Mitro Kuleba, my counterpart from Ukraine, and I have been talking a lot about is how to reinforce Ukraine's position at the negotiation table. And what he asked me and what he has asked the G7 countries in general is more sanctions and more weapons. And so based on that, that's exactly what we're doing.
You know, this is a difficult story to hear when humanitarian corridors are at risk. And as you say, the Red Cross, which is the oldest established organization in the world, does not have access to civilians on the ground. Minister, I know you've had extensive discussions with your Ukrainian counterparts. And you and your team have been working overtime to provide diplomatic support as well as advance the agenda of humanitarian rescue for civilians under bombardment. What more can Canada do to help Ukraine over these next few weeks? And tell us a little bit about how you see Canada's role changing as this war goes on.
Well, we've entered a new era. The world has changed since the beginning of this war. We've seen it through the United Nations. There was an outpouring support towards Ukraine and against Russia. 141 countries came out and voted against Russia's invasion of Ukraine, further invasion of Ukraine. And so we have to take stock of that. What we've done is, and I'm very proud of our diplomats because we've stepped up to the plate. What we've done is really in different forms. So for example, Canada's role within the G7 is really to be the best friend of the US and the best friend to the Europeans. And bridging the UK with the Europeans, making sure also that we're in close contact with the US and that we share information. So that's what we've done. That's what I've done personally. I'm very close to my German counterpart, Annalena Baerbock. We're pretty much the same age and we became really good friends. I'm in close contact with Liz Truss, also the UK foreign minister. So there's 3 women part of the G7, but also close contact with Tony Blinken. Tony and I speak French together. He was raised to a certain extent in France. And so we're able basically to develop that circle of trust where we coordinate everything. So that's for the G7, but for diplomats in general that are representing us at the UN, for example, Bob Ray, or in every single multilateral organization, we stepped up. At the Arctic Council, we decided to work with the Scandinavian countries and the US to make sure that we would isolate Russia. What we've done also is we've petitioned the International Court, Criminal Court, and we've also supported, like I mentioned in my speech, the International Court of Justice and Ukraine's position before the court. So we're trying to do many things at the same time, but clearly the fact that the world has changed is something that, Janice, we have to take stock of, and we need to readdress what will be the world in the coming days, the coming weeks, and the coming months. And that's a collective effort that Canada won't be alone in doing. We will do that with other countries, but clearly there is an issue with the stability of the world right now, and we need to address it.
I know, Minister, that you think about the new kinds of institutions that we're going to need. Let me ask you about another issue. I know as Minister of Heritage that you worked on a problem that I think many Munk School and colleagues and faculty at University of Toronto work on, the issue of disinformation, which is changing the way we understand the story of what's happening. This has been an unprecedented period of disinformation. You talked about denazification in quotes, the stories that Russia is telling its own people bear almost no resemblance to what the rest of us are hearing. Tell us a little bit about what you hope Canada can do to combat disinformation in the future and how that can help to promote and preserve democracy.
Well, a couple of things on that. First and foremost, information is key in any war, because in order for soldiers to go and to fight, they need to know why they're fighting. And if you look at what Russia has done, they've decided to fabricate and manipulate facts to justify their war, because there's no justification for the further invasion of Ukraine. And they started doing it before the war. At the beginning, although all the intelligence was telling us and the information was clear that there were troops that were being gathered more and more at the Ukraine border, they were saying, no, we don't want to start a war. Clearly, the West is panicking for no good reason. Once the war started, then we saw the entire narratives about denazification, like you mentioned, Janice, the question of a genocide being done in the Donbass and Luhansk, and really bombarding Russian people with information that was clearly false narratives and clear propaganda. And then they decided to even go further and really make sure that there would be no independent media voices within Russia, and they're really cramping down on protest and people that have different types of views. So the question of freedom of expression at this point is pretty much null in Russia. Meanwhile, on the West side, I think that the strategy that the US in particular used, which was declassifying information, intelligence, was really important. I think it helped to prevent the war for some time, and it helped Ukrainians get ready, particularly on the military side, but also us as governments to be ready for what was coming up, because clearly this was changing Putin's scenarios. I think also it helped unite Europeans and North Americans on the issue, which was really important. And I think also that it was important for people to get to know in general what was happening. And Blinken's speech at the UN, when he said, "I'm here not to start a war, but to prevent a war," was a powerful one. I think also, though, that this is not, the propaganda is not only happening in Russia, it's happening on new virtual battlegrounds, which are our social media companies. I was talking to the president of Moldova, Janice, Maya Sandu, young woman, very intelligent, electedly, democratically elected. She was saying that her government is under really important propaganda because the Russian regime is trying to vilify Ukrainian refugees by saying they're violent and aggressive to turn Moldovans against them. Well, we know Moldova is just next to Ukraine and they've seen more than 250,000 Ukraine refugees going through them. And the goal of the Russian regime is to definitely turn the democracy in Moldova and to really make it even more into the Russian sphere. So what Canada will be doing and what I want to make sure that we push even more, Janice, is social media companies need to do more to prevent propaganda and to counter any form of disinformation. They're not technological companies, they're content producers. And they have a responsibility and they have to step up to the plate. And that's what I will be addressing in the coming weeks, because it's important Canada takes that issue to the world.
Are you hopeful, Minister, that there will be acceptance or interest by other G7 countries, because one country can't do it alone?
Yes, of course. And I've raised that within the G7. I had a long conversation with Hillary Clinton about the importance also of countering disinformation. She was very supportive. And I think we have to continue because this war is happening with the 21st century tools. And social media, the virtual reality is part of our everyday life at this point. That's where we get our information. That's where all of you are connected, and me to you also. And that's how we operate. But there are some bad actors, and these bad actors cannot spoil this environment in which we are in the virtual world.
It really will be a game changer if we get a consensus that these companies are content producers. That is,
we'll work on that. We'll work on that.
And this was something that I know Minister Joly was working on in her previous ministry as well. But we've seen an extraordinary information war, and you're quite right. This was the first time a government has ever released classified intelligence in the way the United States did. It was a deliberate strategy to shape the information space. So as you say, we are already in the future. You talked, Minister, about refugees.
Yeah.
This we are seeing a massive refugee flow coming out of Ukraine into all the neighboring countries, and certainly the largest one in Europe since World War II, and the largest one, frankly, larger than the Syrian refugee crisis. Tell us about what our government is doing, but also what you're hearing from other governments, because we are now talking about over 3.5 million displaced people, and that number may grow.
Yes. Well, I've mentioned it in my speech. I met with mothers, grandmothers, children, a lot of women, both, because the men are conscribed and fighting in Ukraine. And so they are leaving Ukraine, but they know they have loved ones behind. And there are a lot of people that are extremely traumatized by what is happening. Now, to give you numbers, at this point, we're around 150,000 people leaving Ukraine per day. 1 million refugees per week. And it's growing every day. It's been 23 days where, more than 3 million. So we've never seen that since the World War II. And we think that this will continue. So obviously, this will have an impact on Europe. And that's why I've had many conversations with my G7 colleagues. And that's why Canada needs to step up to the plate. And that's why also Prime Minister Trudeau, my colleague Sean Fraser, the Minister of Immigration, have been clear. We will take an unlimited number of refugees. It's a lot. And so we will work with countries such as Germany, Poland, Romania. I've had many conversations with my counterpart about it, to bring them here. We've launched a visa program yesterday, but we need to make sure that they come here. And we'll work also with the UCC, with Alexandra and her team, because we have the biggest Ukrainian Canadian, well, the biggest Ukrainian community outside of Russia. And we know that there can be a lot of family reunification. And so therefore, Canadians are willing to open their hearts, open their doors. And as a government, we will help them, help Ukrainian refugees to come here, and also help Canadians with their efforts to welcome them.
Let me just say that I've got one or two more questions to ask the minister, but then we will take questions from you. So there are cards, and you can write your question down on the card, and some of our Munk School staff will bring them up. We're also taking questions online from everybody that is online watching, and we're going to get to those questions in just a few minutes. So if you have a question, now is a good time to write it down. Minister, do you think there's willingness on the part of European countries? Is there readiness on the part of European countries to accommodate this number of refugees? I mean, we've seen really tough pictures of people in shelters with the bare bones. How is Poland, Hungary, Romania, those frontline states that you were in last week?
Well, I must say, I was really impressed by the Polish people, because at this point there are websites with people that can register their homes or their apartments to accept Ukrainian refugees. People are outraged like we are, and really I don't see at this point any form of tensions. I see a lot of solidarity, a lot of love and empathy. At the same time, a lot of the refugees want to stay not far from Ukraine because dad or their spouse are there. But at one point, with all these children having to go to school, there's an issue with the numbers of daycares and kindergarten places and elementary schools and capacity in the schooling system of Poland, of Romania, of Germany. These are huge flows of people, like you mentioned, way more than Syria. And so at this point, we need to get organized, and we need to make sure that we play our part, and we need to bring them from Europe to here. And that's why the Prime Minister has mentioned that we're looking at airlift. I've had conversations with my colleagues to see what can be done. But this will require a huge effort, but we're ready.
So let me ask you, just switch just a little bit while we have you here, Minister. It's too good an opportunity to miss. I just ask you two more forward-looking questions. The first of this is, I suspect you're critical of global diplomacy before the war. And some of what we've seen to be blunt in the UN Security Council has not been inspiring. As the Minister of Foreign Affairs, how has the war changed the way we're going to do diplomacy, and what lessons do we need to learn?
Well, I think before this crisis, the West was not as united as it is now. So in that sense, I don't think global diplomacy failed, Janice. I think that we were able to overcome some of the tensions that we're there because of the geopolitical reality we've been in. I think also that for us, this fight is as existential because it is important that we are able to fight for democracy, fight for also the international rule-based order, which has kept the world's stability since the Second World War, and that we fight for principles because democracies are based also on architecture that include the rule of law and the fact that we're democratically elected, but more than that, it is a fight for human dignity. It is also a question of being able to respect the fact that states are sovereign and have a territorial integrity. If we don't have that, it's the far West. So we need to make sure that we abide by the rules. And the rules were constructed to make sure that we could continue to live in peaceful countries. We've been good since the Second World War. There have been regional conflicts. We know that nothing is perfect. We're not perfect. Nobody is perfect. But now we need to make sure that the institutions we have work, and they're not perfect. You know that. You and I have conversations about that. We need to make sure also that Putin fails. There's no other scenario than Ukrainians winning in Ukraine. And we need to counter his disinformation. His disinformation has had an impact in Russia. It has an impact in many countries. Let's be frank. We need to counter it. We need to re-engage. Canada's diplomacy needs to be at its best. We need to be even more on the ground as bit by bit, some of the borders are closing. We need to have our diplomats in these countries to understand what is going on and relay the information.
I can tell you that I'm one of those people who believes we need more budget for our Department of Foreign Affairs. And
Yes,
we need to grow
we can clap, we can
capacity.
clap.
Will not be able to meet these challenges that the minister is talking about unless we grow our capacity. And we have such talented people from all over the world in this country.
Thank you, Janice. I didn't expect you to say that, but
I didn't expect me to say it either. But it really is critical to our future. Here's an online question for you, Minister. Can you tell us how you evaluate China's role thus far in the crisis?
Well, I didn't have the readout of President Biden and Xi Jinping today. So I will obviously look into that after this conversation. But I think first and foremost, China abstained at the UN General Assembly vote 2 weeks ago. And also as a member of the UN Security Council, my expectation, the government's expectation, is definitely that they don't participate in further escalating the conflict. So, Janice, I think. And so, therefore, I've asked our diplomats to convey that position to China. I think also that we need to engage with China, and I'll definitely do that, and also others in the government will do that.
That leads to the next question that just came in. There have been certainly reports in our newspapers that Canada is rethinking its Indo-Pacific strategy. This war has pulled us back deeply into Europe, but the Indo-Pacific remains very important to Canada. Minister, how do you see us moving forward in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, it's part of my mandate letter. This is something that Rob and I will be working on and working with other colleagues, including Han, because we need to make sure that we have an Indo-Pacific strategy. We have a very important Pacific coast. We need to make sure that in thinking of China's positioning on the world stage, what do we do? How do we deal with it? But also, how can we engage in the region in general? Indeed, we have a very strong transatlantic relationship. It has been at the core of our foreign policy for decades. At the same time, while we are reaffirming this, we need to take care also of this new reality. And so that is why I think we should engage with China, but that is why I think also we have to go to the region, and I will be going to the region. And I will work with many experts to make sure that we have a strong Indo-Pacific strategy.
Minister, here's one from one of our students. And it's really a hard question, I think, because it engages both what is happening in Ukraine, but our climate agenda as well. And the question is, Canada and the United States have now banned imports of oil, but Russia still remains the third largest exporter of oil in Europe. How do you see Canada moving forward on this agenda? Is part of the answer for us to export more? And how does this fit with the goals of Canada on climate? And it's a hard question, really.
Yes, it is, but it is an important one because the fight against climate change is existential. So we can't lose sight of what we're doing in order to make sure that we, bit by bit, are able to find new technologies to deal with it. And I think that if I would do a survey here of who thinks that climate change is important, I think I would have a very strong, well, can I do a survey? That's it. That's what I thought. At the same time, the threat of Russia is real. The energy security of Europe is important. And so we need to help them by making sure that they have in the transition the right support on the energy side, and also that we work with like-minded partners. I'm thinking particularly Germany, to find new solutions and new technologies on different a different level. So, for example, when the Prime Minister and Chancellor Scholz from Germany were together last week, and I was with them with Deputy Prime Minister Freeland as well. We talked about the importance of hydrogen and how Canada can export hydrogen to Germany because they're doing at the same time their own transition. So I think with Europe, which has been a very strong defender of the importance of climate change, we can work together to make sure that the transition is happening well.
That's where I think you would agree that the sanctions are leaking.
Well, not for Canada.
No.
Because we ban crude oil,
But
exports from Russia. But at the same time, yes, there is still a link between Italy and Germany and many of these countries. We think it is important that there be ceilings, and bit by bit that we find solutions to decrease the dependency. And clearly, Janice, there is a lot of willingness on the part of my European colleagues to make sure that that dependency is ended.
Yeah, I think that
they're very much aware, and they're on the front lines of what's going on after, obviously, Ukrainians.
So here's a question from a student who asks the following: looking forward, it does not look like Ukraine will be able to join NATO. And President Zelensky has said as much himself, that he does not think that it is likely that he will join NATO. Does Canada think about security guarantees for Ukraine if it is unable to join NATO? Because clearly it will need guarantees.
A couple of things on that. Well, Canada's position has not changed. We believe that Ukraine should join NATO. So that was our position since 2008, has not changed. That being said, I think that in the context of diplomatic negotiations, there need to be security guarantees given to Ukraine. I think it's existential for them, and we need to support them in doing so. And so that's why conversations happening at NATO are really important. That's why also the Prime Minister will be going to NATO next week, and that I'm in close contact with my counterparts. But meanwhile, the fight is happening and people are dying, and we need to send more weapons. We need to be able, I know you didn't ask me the question on no-fly zone. I'm being asked the question on no-fly zone all the time. This is something that a line that we can't cross, but there needs to be a way for Ukraine to defend its airspace. And so hence these anti-missiles weapons and everything we're trying to do to make sure that they can have access to drones, to our cameras, to everything in line with defending their airspace, because a lot of the fight is happening there as well.
Could you say just a little bit more about why there cannot be a no-fly zone? Because you're right, that's in this basket of questions here. How risky would it be, Minister?
Well, so the assessment is done by NATO and all of its members. And basically, it is the fact that doing so would trigger an international conflict. And that's the red line that we don't want to cross. We will do everything possible in our power, just, you know, just next to that red line, but we can't cross it.
So here's a question also from our online audience. Can you tell us a little bit about what Canada, G7 and NATO allies are doing to find and seize the assets that oligarchs have? And do you think they will have an influence as oligarchs, close friends of Putin, find their assets are seized? Do you think they will have an influence on the president of Russia?
It will. It's having an influence. But at the same time, we need to do more. What we need to do is, at this point, is exchange names and entities and exchange information. And that is happening as we speak. We don't have all the same legislations. So, for example, the UK passed its own legislation last week to be able to do something like we have. We have two legislations that are really important, the SEMA one and the Magnitsky Act. And so we've been using these legislation to do more than 1,000 sanctions at this point. And so we're working with the Europeans, so the European Union, with the UK, with the US, and also with Japan. And I haven't mentioned that, but Japan is important in the G7 because they give us also the point of view of what's going on in Asia. And there are clearly links, economic links, and political ones also between Russia and Asian countries.
This is also, not an easy problem to identify. We have shell companies in countries that don't have the same requirements for transparency in their banking systems. Yeah. So it's that kind of effort that just takes more time.
Yes, and we have to talk to the 141 countries that voted against the war to make sure that there's no loopholes. Canada definitely can talk to a lot of our hemisphere friends. We're the best country to be talking to the Americas, to the CARICOM, to all these great countries that we have south of us. And so we'll be doing that. We're also a bilingual country. You can see from my accent that English is not my first language. So we will be talking also with many of the Francophone African countries, and Rob is a specialist of Africa, and we'll be working on that together, and also with many Asian countries. And we will work within the G7 to coordinate these efforts.
What the minister is describing, it seems to me, tell me if I'm right, Minister, you're describing a much stronger NATO alliance, a much more unified NATO alliance, an alliance that is willing to now engage in concrete actions together in a way that we actually have not seen for 40 years almost.
Well, there's nothing like having one villain.
Right.
So, and now what NATO members are doing is also reinforcing the eastern flank of Europe. And so, and we're having conversations also with Finland, which has said that they were looking into security guarantees with Sweden as well. And we haven't talked about the Arctic, but for us, the Arctic is fundamental. And so we need to make sure that we protect our Great North. I'll be working with my colleague Anita Nan, the Minister of Defense, on NORAD modernization, and I'll support her. She's on the lead on that one. And at the same time, we need to work with our American friends and also with Scandinavian countries, because we're all neighbors in the Arctic with Russia.
We only have time for one more. It looks three.
So I don't know whether your questions were tougher or the ones from the students were tougher.
Well, the really tough ones I said came from students.
Okay, good.
Because they always ask the hardest questions. Here's one I think that is worrying everybody, and I suspect it's worrying you too. There has been this repeated US intelligence, and it's getting louder this week, that there was a disinformation campaign about chemical weapons, which suggests, in fact, that Russia, as it finds itself in a stalemate, may consider using such weapons.
Mhm.
We've also heard President Putin talk now 3 times with an implicit threat of the use of some kind of nuclear weapons.
Mhm.
How concerned are you, Minister, that a weapon of mass destruction, an unconventional weapon, could be used if this war goes on? And what can NATO do in an effort to prevent that on the battle in Ukraine?
So there's clearly a level of irrationality in Vladimir Putin's thinking and decision making. And I don't say that without having thought about it and seen a lot of information about it. So I'm very concerned, but I won't talk about the different scenarios here because I think it would not be appropriate. But I think that there is a real security threat. And that is why this is the utmost priority of my team and I, of the Prime Minister, because this is the biggest threat since the Second World War. And so we are supported by the entire West. We will continue to be supported by our friends in Europe and by our American friends and Japanese friends and British friends. But we have to take this seriously. And that is why we have to work collectively to make sure that that doesn't happen.
We're out of time. I'm going to ask you one last question.
Yeah.
What makes you most optimistic as you go through probably the most challenging time that any Minister of Foreign Affairs has gone through in this country since the end of World War II? Where do you find optimism in this world right now?
In people, in Canadians. I think that because people are so shocked by what's going on, we have, as a government, the collective support to do a lot. We can't get tired of these videos of people fleeing Ukraine, of these shelling, of these horrific things that we're seeing online or through our media. We need to continue to be shocked. We can't become numb. We can't become, there can't be any form of fatigue. These are human lives that are being lost, children that are dying, people fighting. This is a real war. And so my optimism comes from you, from Canadians, from Ukrainians, from this immense level of solidarity that we haven't seen in a long, long time. And so we're strong as people. Democracy is about the power to the people. So let's make sure democracy works and that we're united.
I think I speak on behalf of everybody at the University of Toronto our president, our dean, Melanie Woodin, Peter Lowen. Thank you for coming in the middle of all this and
Thank you, Janice.
spending time with us. Peter and Melanie Munk created the school so you could do, Minister, exactly what you did this morning, which is to share with us not only facts, but the context behind the facts, so we understand the gravity of what is at stake here. We're privileged to have had you with us, and you have an open invitation to come back anytime you have any spare time in the future. Please join me in thanking the minister.
Thank you.